በመቀጠል ዶክተር Ezekiel Gebissa. I don't think he needs any introduction, so to speak. He is a household name. And I will do really a disservice if I were to describe his achievements. I'll just say he has had an important role in the political discourse of our country and region. But in short, just for formality purposes, I will simply say that Professor Ezekiel is a professor of history at Kettering University. He got his PhD in history from Michigan State University. He has authored several books, peer-reviewed articles, reports, and book chapters on Ethiopia's cash crop, agriculture, religion, religious experiences, and indigenous knowledge systems. He is a leading and recognized intellectual, public intellectual, and commentator on Ethiopian politics. His political commentaries regularly appear in national and international medias. Having said this, welcome, Professor Ezekiel. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much as well. I will speak in English to Tigrinya speakers who have access to the language and other peoples as well. So I apologize, but I wanted to speak to the larger audience. The panel title, or the topic that was given to me, is The War, Actors, and Regional Peace Consequences. In my presentation, I will not try to describe the horrors of the war or name the multiplicity of actors that are involved in the war, or even speculate about the regional consequences. Those are public knowledge. What I will attempt to do is to give explanations as to why the conflict broke out in the first place, and I speak to that subject in view of imagining and designing a lasting peace in the region. First, before I speak to those explanations, I'd like to describe what it is all about and the characterizations about the conflict in Ethiopia, in the region today. Observers who are unfamiliar with the history and political culture in Ethiopia characterize the conflict that is raging throughout Ethiopia today as a contest, sometimes as a contest between the Prosperity Party and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or between the Tigray regional government and the federal government and its associated regional governments, and sometimes as a contest between the Tigray Defense Force and the Ethiopian National Defense Force and its associates. Now, all of these characterizations are in the international media, and that's why it is important to understand what the conflict in Ethiopia is in the first place. And these characterizations, I picked them up from France 24, Agence France Presse, Bloomberg, the BBC News, Reuters, and The Guardian, and the Associated Press, and CNN, with dates. That's how these powerful organizations, powerful news organizations, portray the conflict in Ethiopia and disseminate that to the rest of the world. So there is a misunderstanding about the nature of the conflict, the depth of the conflict, except the horrors of the war itself. Observers who are considered to be familiar with the Ethiopian political scene, characterize the ongoing conflict sometimes as border dispute, and these are the familiar ones, and war of political difference. Now, to the extent that the Amhara regional rulers claim that they have taken back Amhara land that was forcibly annexed by Tigray 3 decades ago. The conflict may be described as an interstate border conflict. And insofar as the conflict is between political forces who are fighting, on the one hand, to restore a unitary state, and those who subscribe to a multinational federal structure of governance, the conflict could also be described as political. Yet, these factors are triggers in the conflict in the context of a volatile political atmosphere that now prevails in the country. If you look at here the world's ongoing conflict, it is important to note that and how that is characterized. These are conflicts that are raging throughout the world, and Ethiopia is right in the middle of it. But the way the war is characterized in Ethiopia, the conflict in Ethiopia doesn't come under civil war. It comes under political instability. The genocide that Dr. Getachew described is described as political instability. It comes under that general rubric. It's instability. Even though millions are displaced, even though many are slaughtered, massacred every day, even though civilians are dying in the conflict today, the characterization in the international media is incorrect. And if it's not conceived correctly and described correctly, it's not going to be possible to achieve lasting peace in the region. So a better understanding of the ongoing conflict requires a deeper insight into the history and the political culture of the country, particularly a frame of reference for understanding Amhara elite. The Amhara elite, and that's a very nebulous term because no one comes out and say, I am the Amhara elite, but we know them when they speak, we know them when they act. So it's important to understand that. So I like to give 3 factors, or talk about 3 factors as the root causes of the war or the conflict in Ethiopia. And I want to describe this war as a civil war. I would argue that it should be understood as a civil war. If you look at a map by an organization that actually follows conflicts around the world, look at the conflicts. Of course, it is the one in the red. The northern part is, of course, the dominant part, but conflict is throughout Ethiopia. Conflict is all around. You can see all of those areas are areas of conflict. Different degrees, different impact, different scales, but these are areas of conflict. So I'd rather refer to it as a civil war, lopsided, but a civil war. So 3, understand me that when I talk about these 3, it's only for convenience. It is not that these 3 factors are not mutually reinforcing. In fact, it's better to understand them as interlocking and mutually reinforcing to create the condition that occasioned the civil war. The first one is that the war is deeply rooted in Ethiopia's political contradiction of the last half century. That is the first one. Since its inception, Ethiopia's rulers have tried to transform an empire stitched together by warfare and violence into a stable polity by redressing, and here I'm going to quote an authority here, John Markakis. Here is the quote, say that by redressing the imbalance of power that marginalizes the majority of its people and is the cause of endless strife and that holds them in bondage. In other words, the Ethiopian state was unable to overcome the challenge of making imperial subjects citizens of the state. That's the biggest challenge. That is a country that has failed to integrate, that had failed to make people that were made subject through imperial conquests, citizens of the state. The conflict has always been about those who are fighting to become citizens of a state with all its benefits, political, economic, and social and cultural benefits, and others who would want to keep these conquered subjects as subjects. So the struggle basically is between trying to become a state, a citizen of a state, and those who want subjects in perpetuity. This comes actually from a book, Making Citizens in Africa, by the political scientist Lara Smith, who writes, and I quote her again, "The conquered ethnic groups in southern and western Ethiopia were forced to acculturate in order to participate in civic life, and as such, they had very little sense of meaningful citizenship." These two books really, by Markakis and Lara Smith, explain what the contradiction is in Ethiopia, the irresolvable contradiction in Ethiopia. When I say that she's south and western, she's right, but really, so to speak, there is the south in Ethiopia, but there is also the south in the north. There is the south, geographically speaking, but there is also south in the north. You'll see that later on as I try to address this issue. But let's frame what this contradiction is. Despite reforms during the Derg years, small reforms, small steps during Derg years, the Ethiopian state had not bridged the contradiction between, on the one hand, the constant refrain for the so-called unity and territorial integrity of Ethiopia with an all-powerful monarch at the pinnacle of a centralized power, and on the other, a genuine struggle to address the country's diversity and culture in terms of power relations and economic justice. At its core, the civil war that I just described is fundamentally, this civil war is fundamentally the result of the failure of national integration. A civil war between forces that struggle for inclusion in the national life and citizens, and forces that intend to keep them as subjects in the empire in perpetuity. These two positions, or the positions these two forces espouse, eventually coalesced in Ethiopia, and my point is that it is really deeply rooted in the political contradictions of the last half century. It eventually coalesced to two ideological factions. The ethno-nationalists proposing self-determination for nationalities in a federated Ethiopia, and the Ethio-nationalists envisioning a unitary state granting limited autonomy to regions with centrifugal tendencies. Put differently, the ethno-nationalists sought political recognition or autonomy and expression of their identity and protection of their rights as a distinct group. The Ethio-nationalists, on their part, put forth a vision of the Ethiopian state nationalism, embracing Ethiopia as a unified nation without regard to ethnic distinctions, even predicting the eventual deracination of ethnicity altogether. There are jokes that are going around in Ethiopia, which I don't want to spend time about this. But if I tell you just one of them, there was a governor that went to the Gambela region, and he was making a speech to the Nuer in the Anyuak. As someone was translating for him in that speech, he said, you Nuer, you Anyuak, you call yourself Anyuak. Stop that. All of us have become Ethiopians. And as his translator was just translating, finishing that translation, the next thing out of the mouth of the governor was that, you Anyua, Nant Anyua. He just said you are Ethiopians, and then he told them Nant Anyua. And there was an old man who was sitting on the side and smoking guy, that's called a smoking guy. I said, then he took that out of his mouth and said some very bad word, and he said, you just told us we were Ethiopians, now you're taking it away from us? So they say that, but there is no integration. The Gambela, the Nuer in Gambela are always the outsiders. They're called Tekorocho. Bariaocho, that's the way. It's a failure of integration, is my point. Now, so they were predicting that there will be no ethnicity in Ethiopia. Ethiopia would be this paradise where there will be no ethnic distinction. That is the history. And in the last half century, and to make it more concrete, the proponents of these two positions alternately tried to shape the Ethiopian polity. In 1987, the Ethio-nationalists promulgated a constitution establishing the People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the PDRE, granting limited autonomy to 5 regions in order to diffuse rising demands for self-determination. This experiment ended in 1991 when the ethno-nationalists, the EPLF, TPLF, and OLF, toppled the PDRE government along with its prescription of regional autonomy as a solution to the nationalities question. In 1995, the ethno-nationalists adopted a constitution of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, the FDRE, and envisaging Ethiopia as a multinational federal political community in which the nations, nationalities, and peoples would enjoy the right to self-determination, self-government in their regions, and share power in governing Ethiopia at the center. That was a political settlement. And this formula, the ethno-nationalist formula, was the correct solution to the nationalities question had, and this is the qualification, had the forces comprising the ethno-nationalist camp remained allies in the implementation of the constitutional mechanism fully and genuinely. However, once ensconced in power securely, as John Young posits, the TPLF, and quote here, did not seriously entertain the idea of building alliances with existing southern parties. Instead drove them largely out of existence, unquote. This is from John Young. The OLF, and with the OLF, the Oromo nationalism became the first casualty of the drive to clear the political field for the so-called dominant party democracy. Now, outside the political arena, Oromo nationalism became a target for vilification and scapegoating for all of Ethiopia's ills. On the one hand, the Ethio-nationalists represented during the 2005 elections primarily by Knigit, prescribing cultural assimilation and economic liberalism as a solution for the nationalities question, depicted Oromo nationalism, Oromo ethno-nationalism as an atavistic, secessionist, and exclusionary force that poses a threat to Ethiopia's unity, to democratization, and to regional stability. On the other hand, insisting that the nationalities question had been accommodated, the EPRDF and its allies dismissed Oromo nationalism as an ideology of power-hungry elite with an insatiable urge to seize power by whipping up nationalist demands. In the end, neither the liberal assimilationists nor the developmental accommodationists were able to resolve the nationalities question in Ethiopia. The issue of making subject citizens were not addressed. One, going about it the wrong way, the Ethio-nationalists, And the accommodation is suggesting that it's been answered. There is no reason for ethno-nationalist cause. The only thing that remains is development. But they both failed. So the exclusion of a nationalist Oromo from sharing power and ultimately make the Oromo citizens of the state planted the first seeds of discontent, which culminated in the Oromo protests of 2015 to 18. And once the OPDO, the replacement for Oromo nationalism, came to power in 2018, a wide vista was opened for conflict which culminated in the civil war, beginning in Western Oromia against Oromo nationalists, Benishangul, Qimant, Agaw, and eventually the genocidal war in Tigray. That's the difference. It's a clear genocide in terms of scale and in terms of duration of conflict, but this is a civil war in Ethiopia between two irreconcilable visions. So there is no negotiations, no amount of negotiations, cajoling or mediation would have prevented the ethno-nationalists from trying to eliminate the ethno-nationalists using any means necessary. The die was cast in the 1990s because the ethno-nationalist camp was divided. Instead of working together, it was divided. The divide and rule went into effect. And there was no way to stop the ethno-nationalist, the ethno-nationalist, from doing whatever it takes to make sure that they eradicated the works of the 3 decades before that, and then replace it with their own vision that you know. When I say whatever it takes, of course anybody understands this. There is nothing that stops them from doing anything even today, even as we speak. They would like to use war, force, whatever it takes to implement their vision. So negotiations could not have prevented this war. The die was cast in the 1990s. That was the first thing. Another interlocking question is, this is important. This is really important. The second one is the faulty design of the multinational federal states. The current civil war is rooted in the creation of the Amhara regional government during the transitional period in the early 1990s. Prior to this time, there was no Amhara identity and there was no Amhara nationalism. There wasn't. In the early 90s, the Amhara nationalists of today were bristling at the notion that they were to be referred to as Amhara. Remember that debate between Meles Zenawi and Mesfin Woldemariam? The supposed Amhara was saying that we do not exist. And the Tigrayan would say, no, you do exist. They did not exist there as a separate group, but this nationalism and that identity came out of the creation of the regional state in the early 1990s. The Amhara elite believed and maintained the Amhara identity had melted into a shared Ethiopian identity of all ethnic groups in Ethiopia. And intent on opposing the notions that ethno-nationalists espoused and the enshrining of the right of self-determination, the right of nations to self-determination in the constitution, the Amhara elite in the early 1990s strenuously dismissed an Amhara identity and ridiculed the other nations' embrace of their own ethnic identity. Tukur Faranjoch is what they called us in the 1910s. Oromo said, you Tukur Faranjoch. Because we were writing in the Latin alphabet. That they don't exist. It's not that they are denying that the Amhara identity exists. They were telling everybody else, you do not exist, you are all Ethiopians. Remember that speech. Now, the multinational federal structure was formulated based on the linguistic and settlement patterns. And that's what I want to show you, 2 maps here. It is formulated based on the linguistic and settlement patterns of the nations and nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia. In the case of the Amhara state, the regional state structure was formulated just based on the spoken language without considering the actual ethnic lineage of the people and their settlement patterns in what came to be known as the Amhara region. What became the Amhara region, or home to the Amhara, was actually a region comprised of the Agao, the Kamant, the Oromo, the Argoba, and Gumuz, Shinasha, and others. But in creating the non-Amhara populations were forced into a newly created Killil 3 and the Amhara region in the 1995 constitution. Following the creation, and what this shows is if you look at it, and this is for the benefit of this is from 1977, a map from 1977. It's not very clear, but you could see it. You could see it up there. The Tigray, look at Tigray up there. Half of Tigray is now in Afar. What used to be part of Tigray before 1991 is now part of Afar because the spoken language was Afar. The area that they say today is Wolkite and Tsagade, look at it right now, a map in 1977. It is Tigrinya speaking, 1977. Another map, this is during the Derg, I think 1988, look at it, look at the pattern there. What used to be Tigray province, half of it now is in Afar because it's a linguistic and settlement pattern. Number two, what you see with the lined map, it's Tigrinya speaking all the way to the Sudan. Yeah, all the way. Look at that. All the way to the Sudan, the settlement pattern is all Tigrinya. So basically, the creation of Afar and the creation of the Tigray region was following settlement and linguistic pattern. In the Amhara region, it wasn't. It's not the spoken language, it's the settlement pattern. All of these people that I named were there. That was a faulty design. Because following the creation of the Amhara regional state, the people who now identified or forcibly identified themselves as Amhara in Gondar primarily gradually controlled the regional political and economic power and marginalized other groups. Specifically, the regional government was busy erasing the identity of the Agao, the Kamant, the Oromo, and the Argoba in that region. And to roll the demographic characteristics of these peoples into one of Amhara, they fabricated census numbers, the non-Amhara ethnic groups. The fabricated census number was published. The Agao and Kamant were specifically targeted for reduction of their demographic size with the goal of denying their existence in the Amhara region or minimizing their role in decision-making in the affairs of the state. The ethnic groups were targeted for erasure and became clear after the regional government removed them from the national housing and census record of 2007. They don't exist. They don't exist in the census of the country. The erasure started as early as 2007 in the Amhara region. Now, instead of addressing the complaints of these ethnic groups peacefully, the Amhara government started allocating, now listen to them, they started allocating almost half of the regional budget on armament, military training, and preparing for extermination of the non-Amhara ethnic groups. After this supposed change came in 2019, these forces committed untold atrocities, especially against the Kamant people, including displacing about 95,000 of them, killing and detaining hundreds, setting villages on fire, destroying crops, animals, and burning 58 people at stake in Metema, and 5 family members in Gondar, Azazo, and in other areas in September of 2019. So the conflict to erase identities and roll them into Amhara in the region started early on. They were arming, that region was arming. The Amhara state structure reinforced its expansionist ideology, and that is really what ignited the war. And in the past 3 years, the Amhara regional government and the ultra-nationalist party, the National Amhara Movement for Amhara, have jointly launched violent attacks on all neighboring states, Benishangul Gumuz, Oromia, and on a large scale against Tigray, destabilizing the entire country. So the conflict was not what was being said. The conflict is really deeply rooted in the 1990s in the creation of an Amhara regional state where it was not supposed to be created, because that was what is used today as a springboard to continue to fight against Tigray. Okay. Deeply rooted in the state, flawed design of the multinational state, and the last one, where it could have been, the war could have been prevented. And that is the failure of democratization in Ethiopia. Democratization, especially from authoritarian systems to democracy, is a tumultuous process. It's a very difficult process, and it is prone to war. We know this. Political scientists have, one of the best known findings in contemporary social science is that democracies don't fight. Democracies do not abuse their citizens' rights, and they do not wage wars. They resolve their differences in democracies. They resolve their differences through negotiations, give and take. That's the way they do. But when you open an authoritarian system, the old elite, and I'm going to have to shorten it for the sake of, the old elite who've lost power always would try to find their way back to power. And what you see in Ethiopia is that in the case of opening of the system, the relaxation and democratization itself was the reason for open season for conflict, because voices that were not heard in the last three decades now came out to the fore. To the extent, like Dr. Gebissa said, the extent of announcing genocide on television. There is no shame, there is no fear, because they control everything. It is the same elite of the APRDF period that returned to power with an added collaborators from outside. Once they were in power, let me say this about the democratization. Fundamentally, the objective realities in Ethiopia did not favor success in democratization or a successful transition. There was a palpable reformist shift, but a small transition to a consolidated democracy had no basis. There were no essential conditions often associated with the greater chance of democratization. The hope was, if you ask me, why were you a supporter of democratization? The hope was that even though an array of forces were against democratization and successful transition, there were some reasons to hope for success. The country had a constitution that enshrined greater protections of civil liberties. There was a federal structure designed to ensure power sharing and the accumulated experiences of several, albeit deeply flawed, elections that were held in the years after 1995. These were the reasons to hope for. These were the foundations. This is why democratization we hoped for, regardless of the reservations that you could have in the process of transition from an authoritarian system to democracy, regardless of the fact that the Ethiopian realities were not conducive for successful transition. These were in place. But what happened is in the transition was left to elite group that of the old regime. What they did was, and for the sake of time, what they did was they captured the prime minister, and with him the central government. Then the old elite became competitors for democratizing. They took advantage of their positions in government institutions to create a fait accompli, controlling political agendas and shaping the content of information in the media in ways that promote belligerent pressure groups or upwelling of militancy in the populace as a whole on behalf of extremist Ethiopianist ideology or the Amhara ideology of expansion. Once an ideological connection was made between the militant elites and their mass constituents was forged, the old elite elected to jettison electoral democracy while retaining the rhetoric of Ethiopianist, nationalist, populist language. Look, when the Prime Minister was saying that Ethiopia at first repeatedly, that was not just a baseless and meaningful slogan. It was a message that democratization was secondary to the sort of unity that they were intending to construct using any means necessary. It was not a joke. It was not just a stupid aphorism. It was a message that was being signaled to their forces. Now, here is the upshot of my argument here. The upshot of my argument here is that the group that took over power as reformists were not democratizers. Ethio-nationalists took power, and they were determined to bring back the ethno-nationalist vision at any cost. Had democratization succeeded, had the democratization that began in 2018 succeeded, there would have been little chance for conflicts, much less the civil war and the genocidal war that we see today. Political differences would have been negotiated and resolved. What we got in Ethiopia is not democratization, but autocratization. The autocratization of the state allowed for inter-ethnic mistrust and the promotion of exclusionary institutions, elite rivalry, and domestic instability, and ethno-politically polarized society. So the civil war resulted in part from the failure of democratization. Put these three together, and that is the third part in my topic: democratization, the civil war, and the dynamics of state dissolution. The failure of the national integration, my first point. The faulty design of the multinational federation that created the Amhara region, and the failure of democratization. This is the result of the conflict, which is now a civil war in the country. Where is that going? Unless someone prevails over them and resolve this war through a negotiated means. The dynamic is now set in process. The dynamics of state dissolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. Thank you again. I wasn't wrong when I said I would have made injustice of describing you. You fit the bill, actually. Thank you very much. Just እንታይ ስሙ ንምግባር ተን ዓበይቲ ዘለዓለን ፕሮፌሰር ዘለዓለን ሕቶታት ብሓደ ወገን እቲ ዘሎ ዓድና ዘሎ ቅልውላው ከመይ ጌርካ እዩ ዝግለጽ ኢንተርናሽናል ሚድያ ከመይ ጌሩ ይገልጾ ንሕና ከመይ ጌርና ክንገልጾ ይግባእ ዝብል ክልተ ነገር ኣቐሚጡ ሓደ እቲ ኢንተርናሽናል ብጌጋ ብዘይ ምርዳእ ይኹን ብምርዳእ ዝገልጾ ኣገላልጻ ኣሎ ሓደ እዚ ጸገም ኣብ መንጎ Prosperity Party TPLF ገሩ ዝግለጽ ኣሎ ኣብ መንግስቲ ኣብ መንጎ ትግራይ መንግስትን ኣብ መንጎ ናይ ፌደራል መንግስትን ጥራይ ተገይሩ ዝወሰደሎ አመንጎ ትግራይ ዲፌንስ ፎርስን ናይ ኢትዮጵያ ዲፌንስ ፎርስስ ጌርካ ናይ ሙሳደሎ እዚዩ ባይ ኤንድ ላርጅ ቶም ናይ ኢንተርናሽናል ሚዲያ ዝህዎ ካራክተራይዜሽን ኦር አገላልጻ እዩ ተግለጽ ገግቦኦ ዘይግለጽ ዘሎ ግን እዙ ቅልውላዊ እዚ ሲቪል ዎር ምዃኑ እዩ ኣብ ህዝብታት ማእኸል ዝግበር ጎንጽን መቅተልትን ጀኖሳይድን እዩ እዚኦም እዮም ቶም መሰረት ናይቲ እንታይ ስለዚ ሲቪል ዎር እዩ ካልኣይ ዓበይቲ ቁም ነገራት ኣብዚ ኣካቲቱ ዝገበረን in addition to this እንታይ እዩ ትኸድናዮ ሂደት እንታይ ይመስል ለውጥታ ካብ ሕገ መንግስትን ካብ ዝምስረት ጀሚሩ ዝነበረና ሂደት ዝነበሮ ጸገማት ጽቡቕ ነገራቱ እንታይ ነይሩ ጸገማቱ እንታይ ነይሩ ዝብል አልዒሉ ኣሎ እዚ ሓድሹ ኣይኮነን ግን ብዝበለጸ ጌርካ ድማ ኣጸቢቕና ክንርድኦ ብዝግባእ መልክዕ ገሊጽዎ ኣሎ ሳልሰይቲ ኣብ ዲሞክራሲ ኣብ ዓድና ዝነበሮ ተራን ኦር ዘይነበሮ ተራን ብዝምለስ ብዝመሰለ መልክዕ ኣቐሚጥዎ ኣሎ ዲሞክራሲ እንተዝህልወና ነይሩ تزلوا ጸገማት بقليلو متفتحه بزربا مستفتحه بزررم مستفتحه بديالوج مستفتحه ديمقراطي ስለዚህ የበለናን ዲሞክራሲ ንምስራት ውን ተጀመረ በዘይ ምዃኑ in fact ንሱን ታይኮነስ ናብ ኦቶክራታይዜሽን ይዘኸይድ ኦቶክራቲክ ሆነ ስርዓት ሓደ ጨቋናይን ገባራይን ሓዳጋይን ስርዓት ንምስራት እዩ እዚ ተመስሪቱ ዘሎ ዝብል እዩ እዚ ብምዃንና ድማ ትሕዘለና ጸገም ዓብይ በዓብይ መልክዑ ግለጽ ዝኻለ ሳእኒ ናይ ዲሞክራታይዜሽንን እቲ ተጀሚሩ ዝነበረ ብንእሽተይ እውን ተኾነ ብ2018 بفرنج ቆጻጽራ ተጀሚሩ ዝነበረ ፕሮሰስ ንሱ ቅጽል ዘይምኻሉ እዩ ትጭላንጭል ናይ ዲሞክራሲ እውን ናብ ስራሕት ናብ ቅጽል በዘይምዃኑ ዝጸገም እዚ ዓብይ ሽግርን ዓብይ ቅልውላውን ከእትወና ኺሉ እዩ ዝብል بحافش እዩ ዚያንተን ዓበይቲ ብዙሕ አውሽቱ ዓበይቲ ቁም ነገራት ተዘሪው እዩ ስለዚህ ፕሮፌሰር ከምስግን ደሊ ይቅነለ ብጣዕሚ ይቅነልና